The smith slid the forged papers across the table. After a glance to check their credibility, the weasel lunged across and stabbed him in the throat. No screams, just a gurgle, and then a thud, as the man dropped dead. The weasel had decided to leave no loose ends on this one. The papers would allow him to smuggle Zeno and Rel into Braston. The strength of their magic was going to be a challenge to conceal, and he wanted no information to be passed on by the erratic smith. He made the decision before coming here that regardless of the outcome, he would be heading to Scoria to find out about the runes on his coin. This meant he had no more use for the smith or his forging skills, and inversely, the man had far too much information on the weasel to be left with the ability to talk. Without a second thought, the weasel pulled the dagger from his throat and wiped it on his clothes. He collected the forgeries and went out the back door. He had no doubt it would be a few days before anyone discovered the dead body. Now, to find his companion, then collect Rel and Zeno, they had to leave immediately. He found his sidekick walking along the street and struck up some inane conversation as part of his cover, leaving the smith to rot in his house. His companion never said a word. The weasel knew it was a strength in their friendship. He also knew that he would still kill the man if it suited his desires. They made their way to the inn to collect the two magic users. Alan, the third member of their party, had already left the day before with her scratchings of his coin's runes to chase up information from contacts she still held in Scoria. The weasel was always a good judge of character. He knew that if he honoured his side of their deal, they would find a way to honour theirs. They would obtain any piece of information they could for him in earnest. Luckily, Zeno and Rel were exiting the front door with their packs ready to start their journey. Before reaching them, the weasel and his companion turned and started making their way to the stables to get their horses. The two men followed. His companion had organised the horses while he was dealing with the smith so that they could leave with the expediency that was required after murdering someone. The two men behind them had caught up, and with an efficiency the weasel appreciated, stowed their packs and mounted their rides. The weasel made his way towards the southwest road, the opposite direction to Braston. Although he could see the confusion on their faces, Rel and Zeno were smart enough not to ask questions while they were still in town. It didn't take long for the four horsemen to make their way out of Crowwater. As expected, Rel asked about their choice of direction. The weasel explained they would need to enter Braston through a legitimate route to not raise suspicion. Heading straight into Braston from Crowwater would garner far too many questions from the authorities. He assured Rel the trip would not be too much longer, as the road they would be taking was in far better repair than the alternate course. This seemed to satisfy the Manus magic user, and he ceased with his questioning. They rode for a while in uneventful silence. The weasel reached into his pocket to play with his golden coin. The reason he was doing this at all, he wanted answers. He needed to know what the runes etched on the side actually meant. In that moment, his eyes widened. The coin was heating up. He glanced at the two magic users in his party. Neither seemed to be touching the source of their powers. The coin heated only when magic was being used in the area. "The coin!" the weasel whispered, cutting through the silence. They all looked at him, and it dawned on them just what he meant. His longtime companion pulled out a short sword. Rel slipped off his horse and disappeared into thin air. The coin in the weasel's hand heated further as Rel touched on his magic. The weasel stayed on his horse in case he needed to make a fast exit. He glanced around to see Zeno, the onus magic user, dismount his horse. None of them could see the source of the original warming of the coin. Then it hit him, an arrow straight to his chest. That's when they came from the shadows. Braston military, elite soldiers, the weasel surmised as he dropped from his horse, the arrow sticking from his heart. From where he landed, he could see his companions, 3 arrows already jutted from his partner's collapsing body. They had not attempted to shoot Zeno yet. Clearly they wanted the tainted alive. He was the loose end in this encounter. He laughed at the thought as he spat up blood. Absent-mindedly, he noticed the coin heating up further, burning into his skin. Zeno was charging his onus magic. Something was wrong though as he looked at the man. There was confusion in his eyes as soldiers closed in on him. The weasel saw Zeno cast anyway. 2 soldiers were thrown into the air, flying backwards, smashing against trees. One soldier, who must have taken the brunt of the assault, quite literally turned into a bloody red mist as Zeno's power passed right through him. The other soldiers did not flinch and still closed in. Definitely elite, the weasel thought. As he lay there waiting for his heart to beat its last beat and finally pass to oblivion, he caught a glimpse of shadow shift next to Zeno as Rel appeared from nowhere. Unceremoniously, he tackled Zeno, and then with what could only be described as a violent tear into nothingness, they both disappeared. A moment later, that violence to the very atmosphere sparked in front of his eyes as Rel's boots appeared in front of him. He felt a sharp stab of pain as Rel dropped down onto him, and then that tear happened again, only this time he was in it. After a moment's nausea, the weasel adjusted. He was somewhere else. "That's a neat trick too," the weasel coughed. Rel had transported them out of that situation in a heartbeat. He had taken a knee in front of the weasel and was looking over the arrow jutting from his chest. He could tell from the sympathetic look on the man's face that he was already dead. What an end, the weasel thought, as a side note in someone else's story. He should be angry or scared, but weirdly, he wasn't. The concern on Rel's face was such a genuine look, a look he had never received in his life thus far. He couldn't be angry. He played his chips and lost. "Take the coin," the weasel said. With that, the weasel faded from the world, smiling about how he had at least lived his own life, and not one dictated to him. After his last breath, Rel reached into his pockets looking for the coin. He found some money, the golden coin, the papers for their smuggling, and a pin with the sigil of a royal family in Braston. "Zeno, look at this." Rel held the pin in his hand. "It's a prince's sigil." Zeno laughed. Rel just looked at it, confused. Surely he stole it. Zeno shrugged and walked back to where he was and took a seat. Mattered not who the weasel was to him, did not change their circumstances. Rel continued to stare at the pin. Surely the weasel wasn't a prince.